All right, everyone, welcome back to our normally scheduled video. I had to make the previous video because I just left a couple things out, but my just said, the excuse is, and I also could just say, I'm a bit of a spaz. But now we're going to talking about, let's say, stretching powers and talking about why shapeshifting isn't always included. So easiest thing to say about being a stretcher is that you are made out of essentially made out of some kind of very much alive rubber that you can stretch around and do cool things like swing from various surfaces. You can make your legs longer, so the fact that you need to reach something high up, like try to change a very difficult light bulb in like this like a stairwell, that's daunting. And it said, or if you have to put something else up to hide from someone, kind of like kids wanting their presents. It's like it's a place they wouldn't exactly think to look because other things might be blocking it, and the amount of effort it would take to get it down would just hardly be much of anything. You can actually enhance the size of your like hands for simple attacks, and also maybe use things like crude maces or hammers. That was actually something Mr. Fantastic could actually do in the Ultimate Alliance game. I mean, pretty much every time he also attacked, he was actually constantly extending his own, I said his arms, as much as possible. And there was even a trick that, so he could also, sweep, an entire area. He could actually like twirl his arms quite a bit. But a particularly dangerous power he actually had was the fact that he would jump up into the air, um, quickly put his legs on the ground, and the idea was the fact that when he, lets the rest of his body do the work, it creates a massive shockwave. But unfortunately, he was actually the only person that had used an external attack for his critical that because it was just basically he was just linked up to a satellite and blasted you like instead of from above. Technically, Iron Man had something, but I always just thought like he had, but he always had something else that was always naturally with him, and the fact that he also had energy blasting powers, so it wasn't entirely um, out of place. So one thing that was also used, actually shown in the first Fantastic Four movie, was he actually was able to make his chin bigger. Say it was stronger man. They actually showed he was actually able to morph his face, said kind of morph his face into Wolverine as a joke, and that's a very basic form of essentially shape shifting. I mean, in the fact that you're just essentially just doing your own plastic surgery, but it's not like, but in this case, you wouldn't be able to disguise your eyes. It's an eye color. Um, and maybe in this case, if you're not very good with voices, it's not going to sound as much. It's not like how Superman was actually able to imitate Batman and Robin's voice one time, in which the latter was actually very creeped out by it. So that would also be an issue. I mean, it's one thing you possibly can do is basically, if you show like if you could actually stretch yourself out fully and then just kind of just inflate yourself so Mr. Fantastic could look like the Thing, and that might give him some degree a better physical strength, but maybe nowhere near what it actually would do. So, so in this case, that's more just like advanced kind of, it's some kind of body morphing, not we would say like true um, shape shifting. Of course, they also kind of showed there are some issues with that. In the first Fantastic Four movie, he asked, what happens when you superheat um, rubber? He said it definitely does melt. I mean, anyone who's ever found an old rubber band try to stretch it, it immediately just kind of snaps. You know, he said after it kind of, he said, but if it does heat, it's there. It smells terrible. Kind of like how in this case, actually Nike sneakers got started because a guy needed a tread for his shoes, so he just put, some, cut out the right shape. Um, and you put it on a waffle iron, and that was it. So definitely is capable of melting. I'm not entirely sure of any super advanced rubbers that would allow for a greater amount of resisting. But then again, he was blasted by a bolt of lightning from a very spiteful Doctor Doom. And then if you actually, if you actually freeze the said freeze rubber, it gets very, very hard and looked like, it was just painful, for everything. And again, it said you could almost would say it's almost like he was actually able to, um, like actually having the normal flex, like just a normal bit of flexing, but the fact that it was going a little bit beyond what a human's normal range of motion would be, doesn't may not actually feel good. And then like the Miles Teller version, he actually was, constantly wore these kind of springs that would show him, that would kind of let him go back, but they never really, showed him like really, really stretching. Like he like wouldn't just take like one of them and like do some like little stretching exercises. So it's like, okay, I can go a little bit farther now, but still be a little on the floppy side because the whole goal is to like hold everything out and then, kind of, wobble it around like kind of like just a really big pole. So it definitely would take a lot of practice. I know that in Incredibles with Elastigirl, she was actually able to make herself like really, really thin to avoid um, to avoid like some whatever those like rail cars were. Forget if they actually are a proper name or what else they actually are. And she was actually able to use that to kind of become a kite when she actually flew in Incredibles 2. So that would also be a bit of an issue because the fact that essentially, if you can't quickly, you know, go back and forth as much, it could be pretty exhausting. And then you also have to worry about the actual clothes because actually in the Incredibles commentary, they had like this interview, and apparently she just said that if she just did a quick flexing, she literally just ruined her outfit. And but it seems like Edna Mode was able to figure everything out. They showed the suit that was able to stretch pretty far, virtually indestructible, but super breathable. And with someone like if you're part of the Fantastic Four, you do have the self-regulating unstable molecules to use it. So in theory, you could actually put on someone else's costume, and it would still be fine. But if you don't have those kind of access things, that could be a bit of a problem if you're just kind of more of a stretcher. And but then and then again, other things might be quite capable of stretching. I mean, look at a symbiote. They can technically stretch themselves quite a bit, but maybe they won't actually be able to create too many complicated, shapes to hide in plain sight. Then again, they would just actually just be able to press themselves up against the surface and just blend in with it like a cuttlefish, so they don't actually need it. Let's so, but then again, you may also have to differentiate what type of stretcher you actually are, because characters like Elongated Man and Plastic Man are meant or were supposed to be kind of different things back in the day. I would say Elongated Man is definitely meant to be the far better stretcher because he really doesn't have any other tricks. He can maybe he would the Justice League Unlimited version said he held the shape of a vase for like 3 days, which is fine. But it's like if someone says, "Well, how far can we actually see you stretch out?" And some databases say Mister Fantastic could actually stretch as much as 1,500 feet. Then if you saw the Rise of the Silver Surfer, he was actually able, was actually trying to hold the London Ferris wheel, in place. That would definitely be something. And we have to make sure that as you are fully stretching, you can maintain all of that, integrity. So one could actually say maybe he doesn't, respond to temperatures nearly as severely as others um, as that. But someone like Plastic Man, I would say he can definitely stretch, but he's more of a shapeshifter They showed him like being like turning into a rocket. They showed him being a plane and some kind of things. You know, I mean, in this case, he said plastic and rubber can be fairly similar depending upon the composition. I would say he could do other things. He said do a decent amount of stretching, but his body has to maintain whatever he does because if you're having something that's like moving parts, um, you kind of run into that like the T1000. Like yes, you do have solid constructs, for combat, but he said that was just a T1000, not something like a Rev 9 or the TX, which is merely just kind of which the latter just kind of just remove the liquid metal just to be able to essentially just to actually deploy actual weapons. So it'd be almost kind of like the idea of being, you have a symbiote, but you haven't bound, it hasn't picked up any powers or weapons like essentially when it became Ancient Venom, it had quite a bit of weapons and armor, that made it incredible. So you never know, but it always kind of seems like with Plastic Man, he doesn't actually wear like clothes anymore. So I mean, nothing's really exposed, and he always kind of seems like whatever he transforms into is essentially it's the same, as his thing. So you see the red, black, and yellow or gold. It depends on who's drawing who's coloring everything. So you would know what it is. It's kind of like the idea of literally looking at every house designed by Mr. Brady and the Brady Bunch. How he pretty much just designed his house over and over again. Just what went in it was, everything. Like he, was good with the interior, but he just was terrible, designing the exterior. So, so you just like that could be a definite weakness because in this case, Batman was actually able to detect him in the Injustice movie because essentially it was the only red suit as a chair in the room. It's like, really, dude? You couldn't have tried anything else? I mean, and he definitely was also able to show like he could make a key out of his body and do other things, but they didn't really allow him to strut his stuff as much. So, and just hasn't really been adapted because the guy's kind of a maniac, so there's a lot of bad things. But if you're actually talking about more of a stretcher and advanced shapeshifter, then you want the Madame Rouge from the Teen Titans series. She was actually shown, perfectly imitating Robin. Then I've said for a while, and she actually made it look like she randomly just produced a communicator out of her hands just to make it look more convincing. But essentially, but you couldn't really tell anything. The only slight issue was the fact that when she was actually near Hotspot, she was actually quite a bit more vulnerable. In this case, maybe the rapid shape shifting could also be an issue. Would be That's why she'd be a bit more vulnerable. I mean, said Martians also have that ability. I mean, there's a primal fear that it is there, but in theory, that if you were to just say, okay, what exact said this is what happens when I get right near a flame, it's causes some issues. Because you never know. Like sometimes it might just be the fact that you know you can't maintain you just immediately go back to your default kind of thing. Because apparently, while Carnage is actually quite flammable, far more flammable than any other symbiote. He actually says he does enjoy the heat, but when he does enjoy actually feeling warm, but he has to be the one that makes the fire source. So, and then again, even if you do imitate someone by stretching and manipulating yourself, you don't want to have to try to prove yourself. So you don't want to be the character that is imitate the Flash and you can't really seem to run. And it's not like and they've given you all the chances to recharge. It's like maybe kind of like what I said in the previous video. Maybe his power level is actually very, very low. It's like you're only a shapeshifter in terms of outward appearances. Like you need something a bit more. I said you need to be something different because like Clayface, they actually showed him in the Batman imitating weird things in a wax museum, and he even pretended to be a vault door. So when Batman went to go look behind and saw it was still closed, that was kind of the trap. But then again, they also showed the fact that um, essentially for a while he was actually a villain because he could not turn himself back into himself. It was like it seemed like like he was able to imitate like actual people, turn into Solomon Grundy, which was probably easy, because he does have some degree of superhuman strength. But the fact that he couldn't just get a picture of himself and change back for a while, that was definitely a problem. And actually, when he was touched, for the first time by his partner, just a ground thing on the shoulder, he said, "Oh, you're wet." And it's like, "Oh, I just got out of the shower." So so you never know. But he was actually able to split himself into two beings. So if something like that were to happen to you, as a shapeshifter, you probably have to be very close on everything. So you can be a little bit on the stretchier side, but you also can do some interesting things like in Static Shock Rubber Band Man. He actually turned himself into a trash can to hide from Static, and Static was actually able to essentially lift his head off, just to see like there was anything else before, turning back into Virgil Hawkins. Um, so it was definitely interesting, but when he had to imitate um, when he actually had to imitate a vacuum cleaner, he couldn't make any wheels because apparently they were hard. Like he wasn't giving any practice. And then when he actually imitated, a woman at a music event, he was doing, he was almost like he was just doing an awkward woman's joke instead of voice. Like, so it's just like, okay. So that could definitely be an issue. But said interesting enough, his brother Ebon was actually a stretcher, and when they actually showed him pretty much without a shadow form, toward and said in the series finale, he was actually shown actually using it, like it was actually able to stretch, his body, but it seemed like it was difficult for him, and he was just essentially just a living shadow. So he could definitely do things kind of like with Venom, you know, and even like create like other limbs, but it was more like it was a dark field around him rather than being made out of rubber. And so that that's pretty much a basic thing I always kind of thought about with that. So in terms of like shape shifting, an easy example showing how things might be a bit different would be someone like with Mystique. She can just imitate someone's form, you know, imitate forms, and maybe even have things like the extra Wolverine claws that at one point was shown actually was just sharp enough to actually slice through, an aluminum said fence. But when actually confronted by the real adamantium, it really really hurt. So, but in this case, it always seemed like what she was mostly doing is the fact that it was like everything was just kind of peeling away, like you were just manipulating the shape of something, and that was it. But it seems like she can only do humans, but yet, she can imitate voices and other biometrics pretty well because in the first X-Men Legends game, when she goes to free Magneto, she gives both a voice and a handprint. It's like, poof, you're a perfect copy for someone unless you're using some kind of mutant tracker. So said there can be limits to that. I actually kind of like someone like that, a Beast Boy, because he's actually been shown doing some interesting was shown doing some interesting things in the Teen Titans series. Like he was more than capable of turning himself into a massive whale to try to stop him, to stop and try to stop a robot named Atlas. But yet he was actually able to shrink himself down to an amoeba, try to make Cyborg better after making him sick. And yet he was actually able to fully replicate himself, like an actual bacterium. But in this case, they show him like if he turns into a skunk, he can fully spray you, gain like all the strengths of various animals. But naturally, anyone who knows the character Beast Boy everything's going to be, he's just going to be green because that's just kind of what happened, when he got his powers. So essentially, that is definitely fully fledged shapeshifting, on a pretty good level, but it is technically limited to animals, but he actually has the ability to that if he goes to a place like when they went to Planet Tamarin, he was able to imitate one of the animals there. It's like there's some kind of animal biosphere that's saying, "Hey, you want to use these for a little while? Here you go." Of course, I also thought it was kind of interesting when he actually turned himself into Chewbacca. So that is definitely kind of interesting. So there definitely can be different uses for that. He was actually able to turn himself into a kaiju and then the arch enemy of the massive Starro, just to make sure everything was there in the comics. But I always just kind of wondered, it said, would he ever be able to exceed the normal limits of a regular animal? Like yes, this is like if he turns into a cheetah, could he actually run, a little bit faster, maybe run a little bit longer, up there? Now, if he actually fought against like a real gorilla, would he actually be able to outmuscle him? Like something else that could actually happen. And there was actually a moment where he actually showed him producing just a tentacle and a crab claw, just on his own. So it seems like he can kind of control that. And he was actually able to kind of spit in the face of Mumbo the Magician, who was turning all the other Titans into animals. It's like, I already do that, man. So he just turned them into various machines that could be a bit different. Like he actually was one of those old timey telegraph messages. He was actually able to like turn himself into a like phone. I mean, it wasn't fully like as the thing, but if you're thinking about like the telegraph thing, where exactly is he getting the stuff to actually make all the paper and the ink? Mm, no different than basically having like animal skin. So that's definitely different. But another character from Static Shock was called Replicon. He actually was just this scorned music person that he could essentially turn himself into various things, kind of like Jack Jack, because at one point he actually turned himself into a wooden character, into a wooden person, and he essentially, was immune to everything. And it seems like all he just has to do is look at it and think about it, and it can be, he can actually gain some of those powers. Although he was outdone by his conceit because he imitated AJ from the Backstreet Boys, but the tattoos were on the wrong place. It was like looking at yourself in a mirror rather than just, there it is. Like if you were just right behind him, poof, everything else is there, so no one would suspect anything. Whether or not, you would have the a full massive scale if you turn it's a bit of power. So if you imitate like the Hulk or Solomon Grundy, would you actually keep everything? But then again, he was kind of a one-off villain, so they never really got a chance to see everything, what he could and could not do. But you never know what could have been like if they could have shown anything. Like in theory, is that like going to an alternate reality where all the villains are actually heroes, or at least more accepted for what they are. So yeah, but then again, they also had the character of Puff in that. I said in one episode, actually in the episode where you met Rubber Band Man, she actually was just able to make some kind of cloud around her that imitated a police uniform. And so I guess in this case that's not too bad. You're just kind of putting the right kind of stuff together. But if she got wet from like rain or anything, she wouldn't be able to use her abilities. So there definitely are some issues with everything because you never know. So depending, and it also would kind of depend upon maybe like your species because Martians seem to have like virtually every power that like roughly the same powers that like Superman has, but they can walk through walls, and they showed John Jones actually stretching like he was a rubber character and can shapeshift. And even at one point, he was pulled apart. And he was actually just able to kind of morph himself back. So different limits could be in there. So it's I would say there's could be like some kind of cosmic shape shifting mojo. So the fact that you don't want to be so if you're want to turn into gorilla but you want to make it as fast as a cheetah, maybe that doesn't actually work, but maybe you can find some way to create like some kind of chimera form that actually has the best of both worlds. But you never. But then again, if you turn into some kind of animal that has a very um, impressive sense of smell, and there's something just absolutely terrible around, it's not going to be. You do have those vulnerabilities. So I'm not entirely sure if there's anything else. I mean, if you are technically, if you were like said had like nanotech, you could possibly imitate other technological things. You could possibly say that Ben 10 is also an interesting shapeshifter in the fact that he can just kind of choose what he wants and whenever said when the plot armor kind of suits him. But oddly enough, he could actually um, switch everything back over to human because at one point he had to be like in three places at once. So he turned to Echo Echo, and then it was like okay everyone, like turn it to human, which basically just he turned to the side, and then that's he was able to use that. And then they actually had a version his future self, like in this case, he would just kind of put the omnitrix symbol on his chest, and he would just call out the name of everything. So it's almost so you can technically borrow the powers of something, but not entirely sure what everything could be like. Because um, maybe in this case, you're a character that is super vulnerable to magic. When you turn into it, kind of like the idea of saying, "Okay, I'm a vampire." Said, "Okay, direct sunlight is," and said, "will definitely burn you pretty good." He said, "You're a wearer beast. Here comes silver." So you just kind of have to choose what you actually want to have and say what you want to have to turn yourself into. And if you are a stretcher with everything, make sure you know what I said how far you can stretch, how long you can maintain it, and if you do have some vulnerabilities to chemicals and what's it said in temperature. I'm not entirely sure too many chemicals that are specifically meant to react with rubber, but you never know if there's going to be something that can melt plastic that it kind of turns a bit, I said, on the rubbery side, but you just kind of never know. So hope everyone enjoyed that. The next topic I'm going to cover are chemical-based powers. Essentially, you can literally start use various things to the periodic table of elements to help you out, but there are definitely some issues with that. So look forward to that video. All right, have a good one.